Hello, everyone. Tonight we will begin with the topic 15 things that would get you labeled a witch in the Middle Ages. So, before you get comfortable, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I'm doing here. And feel free to let me know in the comments. It's always exciting to see who is joining us from all around the world. Now, let's dim the lights and enjoy tonight's journey together. 1. Cat companions equals demon familiar. How owning or petting a cat could seal your fate. Picture this. You're sitting in your cottage at the edge of a medieval village, the fire crackling low, and on your lap purrs a small, harmless cat. In today's world, that image conjures coziness, warmth, and maybe even a meme-worthy Instagram post. But in the Middle Ages, it could just as easily mark you as a servant of Satan. Cats, those quiet, watchful companions, were seen less as pets and more as physical proof that you were consorting with evil. And this wasn't a superstition confined to a corner of Europe. This belief permeated entire cultures, shaping laws, sermons, and sometimes life or death decisions. The roots of this paranoia trace back to the church's attempt to control narratives around good and evil. By the 13th century, cats, especially black ones, had been firmly tied to demonic symbolism. Pope Gregory IX went as far as issuing decrees that explicitly linked cats to devil worship. What followed was grim. Mass killings of cats across towns and villages. Ironically, this zealous attempt to purge evil may have worsened the Black Death itself. With fewer cats roaming fields and alleys, rat populations exploded, and with them came plague-bearing fleas. It's one of history's darker examples of how superstition fueled tragedy. But why cats? To medieval villagers, cats embodied mystery. They moved silently, saw in the dark, and seemed to appear where they weren't wanted. For people who believed in the constant tug-of-war between heaven and hell, these qualities felt less like biology and more like sorcery. If you spoke to your cat, neighbors could interpret it as you whispering orders to a demonic familiar. If the cat scratched someone, the wound was proof of a supernatural attack. Even a stray cat lingering near your doorstep turned into a furry accusation. Villagers didn't need evidence. They needed only coincidence and suspicion. Now let's step back and think about this through modern eyes. Cats, as we know, are simply independent creatures. They hunt, they roam, and they develop deep bonds with humans on their own terms. The so-called familiar myth likely arose from the fact that cats were so good at pest control, silently stalking rodents in barns and grain stores. What appeared to be magical intervention was actually biology and behavior. Yet to people without that knowledge, their uncanny talents seemed unexplainable, therefore dangerous. This tells us something universal about human nature. When we don't understand something, we often fear it. A striking real-life parallel comes from the testimonies in witch trials themselves. In some cases, women were accused simply because they fed strays. To us, that sounds like compassion. To them, it looked like maintaining a demon's strength. One woman in Essex, England, was condemned after villagers swore they'd seen her cat suckling on her arm. From her perspective, it might have been nothing more than a curious kitten nibbling for milk. But to her neighbors, it was an infernal pact made visible. When fear clouds judgment, even the most innocent gestures become damning. And here's where it gets chilling. The superstitions surrounding cats wasn't just about individual households. It reshaped entire communities. By killing cats en masse, towns disrupted ecological balance, inadvertently worsening conditions that allowed disease to spread. Fear of witches created an echo chamber of cause and effect. The plague hits? Clearly, Witches cursed the land. Crops fail? The cat-loving widow must have whispered to the fields. This cyclical blame system ensured no one was truly safe. Every villager knew that what they fed, petted, or even glanced at could be used as evidence against them. But let's not stop at condemnation. Let's think about what this reveals about the human psyche. Cats represented the unknown. They were nocturnal in an age when nighttime was terrifying, filled with dangers both real and imagined. They were aloof in a society that valued conformity and predictability. In many ways, cats embodied independence, the very quality that women accused of witchcraft were feared for. Owning a cat was not just a matter of affection. It symbolized self-sufficiency, mystery, and control over one's space. And that, in a rigid patriarchal society, was profoundly threatening. When you consider the broader cultural impact, the suspicion around cats becomes a lesson about scapegoating. A cat wasn't simply a pet, it became a mirror into society's anxieties. Disease, hunger, and bad harvests needed an explanation, and because science had yet to illuminate cause and effect, people leaned into superstition. Instead of looking at sanitation, rats, or nutrition, they looked at their neighbor's cat and saw the devil's shadow. This is the same logic we see today when conspiracy theories take hold. Complex problems get pinned on simple, visible scapegoats. And yet, in the midst of persecution, cats endured. They reappeared in art, folklore, and mythology across Europe. Some cultures even venerated them. In Norse mythology, Freya, the goddess of love and fertility, rode a chariot pulled by cats. This duality, cats as symbols of divinity and of damnation, shows how deeply humans project their fears and hopes onto the natural world. In fact, that duality remains today. While black cats are often associated with bad luck in Western superstitions, in Japan they're symbols of good fortune. If you imagine yourself in the shoes of a medieval villager, the paranoia is understandable, even if irrational. Your world was uncertain, plagued by illness, crop failure, and war. Seeing your neighbor talk to her cat at night, then watching a storm ruin your harvest the next day, felt like more than coincidence. Suspicion became survival. But when we zoom out, the story of cats in the Middle Ages reminds us how destructive unchecked fear can be. Not just to individuals falsely accused of witchcraft, but to entire societies undermined by superstition. So the next time your cat curls up on your lap and stares at you with those otherworldly eyes, remember, to your medieval ancestors, you'd already be marked for trial. But to us today, it's a story about how ignorance and fear can transform companionship into condemnation, and how even a purring friend could become a perilous liability in the wrong historical moment. But why cats? To medieval villagers, cats embodied mystery. They moved silently, saw in the dark, and seemed to appear where they weren't wanted. For people who believed in the constant tug-of-war between heaven and hell, these qualities felt less like biology and more like sorcery. If you spoke to your cat, neighbors could interpret it as you whispering orders to a demonic familiar. If the cat scratched someone, the wound was proof of a supernatural attack. Even a stray cat lingering near your doorstep turned into a furry accusation. Villagers didn't need evidence. They needed only coincidence and suspicion. 2. Herbal wisdom. Witchcraft alert. Knowing healing herbs might mark you as a sorceress. Now, let's move deeper into the world of suspicion by stepping into the herb gardens of the Middle Ages. Imagine a woman carefully tending to rows of chamomile, valerian, and peppermint. To us, she looks like an early herbalist, or even a grandmother passing down wisdom of natural remedies. But in her time, this simple act could brand her a witch. Why? Because knowledge, especially knowledge that worked, wasn't trusted if it didn't come from the church or sanctioned doctors who relied more on bloodletting than actual healing. Herbs were not just plants, they were portals of suspicion. If you knew that chamomile tea soothed a stomach, that valerian calmed anxiety, or that willow bark reduced fevers, you were already treading dangerous ground. The church promoted the idea that true healing could only come through prayer, divine intervention, or costly rituals overseen by men in authority. So if you, a village midwife or healer, restored someone's health without all that ceremony, it raised eyebrows. The reasoning was simple. If your treatment worked, you must have had help from the devil. This twisted logic created a paradox. If you were too successful, people whispered you were casting spells. If you failed, people muttered that you were sacrificing lives to dark powers. Either way, suspicion clung to you. Imagine offering peppermint infusion to a farmer doubled over from indigestion. He feels better within a day, thanks to the natural oils easing his stomach muscles. Instead of gratitude, villagers might whisper, "She bewitched his insides." Suddenly your garden becomes Exhibit A in a trial. Your jars of herbs recast as ingredients of curses instead of cures. And the suspicion wasn't only about what herbs did, it was about what they symbolized. Mandrake root, for example, was infamous. Its forked shape looked vaguely human, and legends said it screamed when pulled from the ground. Screams powerful enough to kill. Owning a mandrake was enough to prove you dabbled in forbidden magic. Even harmless plants could be dangerous in the eyes of neighbors. Lavender, basil, rosemary, today they're kitchen staples, but back then they were double-edged. Seasonings on one side, suspected sorcery on the other. Let's pause and reflect. In modern times, herbal knowledge is celebrated. We call it natural medicine, holistic wellness, or even science. Because so many of these plants have active compounds validated by modern pharmacology. Willow bark gave us aspirin. Foxglove gave us digitalis for heart disease. Peppermint continues to be prescribed for digestive issues. What medieval villagers saw as sorcery was actually early chemistry. It's a stark reminder that ignorance can turn wisdom into heresy. There's also a gendered undertone to this suspicion. Much of herbal knowledge was held by women. Midwives, widows, and healers who learned remedies through generations. These women occupied a unique place in society, respected when their remedies worked, feared when they worked too well. Male physicians, often trained in monasteries, relied on expensive treatments that few could afford. When a local woman healed someone with common plants, it threatened not only church doctrine, but also male authority. Branding her a witch became a way of policing both knowledge and gender. One real-life example comes from Germany in the 15th century. A woman named Walpurga Hausmannen, a respected midwife, was accused of witchcraft after several infant deaths in her care. In truth, childbirth mortality was tragically common at the time, but her knowledge of herbs and her role as a healer made her a convenient scapegoat. Under torture, she confessed to using potions to harm children. Her skills, once valued, became reinterpreted as evidence of evil. The suspicion of herbs also points to a deeper cultural fear, the fear of mystery. Imagine a villager who prays daily for his fever to break, but continues to suffer. Then, an herbalist provides a tea that works overnight. In his mind, what explains the failure of prayer and the success of a leaf? Instead of accepting that nature had its own gifts, he concludes, it must be dark magic. In essence, superstition filled the gap where scientific understanding was absent. Think too of how herbs blur categories. Chamomile calms, but too much could cause deep sleep. Valerian soothes, but overuse could sedate dangerously. This duality frightened people. They weren't wrong to see herbs as powerful. They just misinterpreted that power. In their minds, if a plant could both heal and harm, it wasn't a tool of nature. It was a tool of the devil. So what can we learn from this? At its heart, the persecution of herbalists is a lesson in the danger of misunderstanding science. When we lack explanations, we tend to insert fear, myth, or accusation. And just as herbs were mistrusted then, so too are new technologies often feared today. Artificial intelligence, genetic modification, even vaccines, all have sparked suspicion in those who don't understand them. History shows us that knowledge without explanation often gets branded as witchcraft. Imagine, finally, being that medieval woman tending your herb garden. You know that your teas help, that your ointments soothe, that your tinctures restore. Yet every time a patient recovers, you see the suspicion in neighbors' eyes. Your garden is both your pride and your peril. Every plant holds healing, but in the wrong circumstances, every leaf could become an accusation. It is here that the everyday becomes dangerous, where wisdom becomes witchcraft, and where survival means hiding the very skills that might save lives. 3. Left-handed. Sinister side. Why being left-handed was equated to evil. Let's shift now to something as simple as which hand you favored in daily life. In the modern world, being left-handed means a little inconvenience. Smudged handwriting, awkward scissors, and the occasional joke about creativity. But in the Middle Ages, being left-handed was more than inconvenient. It was dangerous. It was an identity that could draw suspicion, whispered accusations, and in some cases, charges of witchcraft. The very word for left in Latin, sinister, literally came to mean evil. From language to religion to art, the left hand carried a heavy burden of symbolism that turned a natural variation into a mark of the devil. Why was the left hand viewed so harshly? First, medieval Europe operated on symbolism. The right hand was seen as orderly, divine, and holy. In religious art, Christ blessed with his right hand. Angels extended their right hands to mortals. Even oaths in court or ceremonies were sworn with the right hand raised. By contrast, the left hand was painted into scenes of damnation. Devils gestured with their left hands. Sinners were cast to the left side of Christ in depictions of Judgment Day. The association became so embedded that simply using your left hand suggested alignment with darkness. On a practical level, left-handedness also stood out. In a society obsessed with conformity, anything unusual drew attention. A left-handed child writing awkwardly, or a man lifting his cup with the wrong hand, sparked murmurs. People didn't like difference, and difference became fertile ground for suspicion. If you were a left-handed scribe, your backward writing looked unnerving to eyes already primed for paranoia. If you were a left-handed soldier, fighting with your weapon in the wrong hand, villagers concluded you had unnatural skill, because how else could you defeat right-handed opponents? Let's imagine a real-life scenario. A boy in a medieval village grows up reaching instinctively with his left hand. His parents, fearing gossip, tie his left hand behind his back to train him out of it, a common practice well into the 19th century. If the boy resisted, whispers started. Why was he so stubborn? Perhaps darker forces guided him. Over time, this reinforced cycle left children scarred, both physically and emotionally, for something as natural as handedness. The stigma outlasted the Middle Ages, lingering for centuries. Here's the deeper insight. Left-handedness wasn't just about the body. It was about fear of disorder. In a world already fragile, where crops could fail, disease could strike, and wars erupted without warning, people clung to symbols of order. The right hand represented God's order. The left hand represented chaos. It's no coincidence that the word right also means correct, while left became a synonym for crooked or twisted. Associating left-handed people with witchcraft was a way to categorize them, to put them in a box that explained their difference. But pause for a moment. What if, instead of seeing left-handedness as sinister, we looked at it as unique? Today, we know left-handedness has biological roots. It's linked to brain lateralization and even creativity. Some of history's greatest thinkers and artists, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Marie Curie, were left-handed. But in a medieval village, da Vinci himself might have been accused of sorcery, simply for sketching with his left hand. This shows us how societies can turn potential strengths into stigmas when ignorance dominates. There's also the battlefield element. A left-handed knight could catch opponents off guard. Swords clashed differently. Shields were angled unpredictably. Instead of recognizing this as tactical advantage, medieval culture labeled it unnatural. Think about how dangerous that misunderstanding was. What could have been admired as skill became interpreted as witchcraft. Flattery was replaced by fear, and fear often ended in trials. The church also reinforced this prejudice through art and ritual. In countless paintings, the right hand was a tool of blessing, while the left hand became a tool of rejection. Imagine sitting in church week after week, staring at murals where the damned were cast to Christ's left side. If you were left-handed, how could you not feel condemned? It's not surprising that many tried to hide their natural tendencies, forcing themselves into right-handed conformity just to survive. But here's the human irony. The same society that condemned left-handedness also relied on it in ways they didn't even realize. Left-handed workers may have been skilled in crafts requiring different angles. Left-handed fighters brought unpredictability to the battlefield. Left-handed scribes sometimes developed mirror writing that, while strange, was also secure against easy copying. In other words, difference had value, yet value was overlooked because fear drowned it out. Think, too, of the personal toll. A left-handed woman stirring her pot counterclockwise might be accused of casting spells on the stew. A left-handed farmer grasping his scythe differently could be marked as suspicious. People weren't just punished for being malicious. They were punished for being themselves. That's the cruelest part of superstition. It transforms identity into guilt. So what lesson do we carry forward? At its core, the stigma of left-handedness teaches us how deeply language and symbolism shape reality. When a culture brands something as evil, that belief can warp perception, ostracize individuals, and even destroy lives. But when knowledge grows, when science replaces fear, we see difference not as danger, but as diversity. Next time you see someone writing with their left hand, think of the long line of history they carry, the whispers, the punishments, the suspicion that once clung to them. Today, left-handedness is often joked about as quirky or creative, but in the medieval imagination, it was a one-way ticket to the stake. The same action, writing a note, lifting a cup, swinging a sword, could be life as usual today and life-threatening 500 years ago. And that contrast shows us just how far we've come and how dangerous fear can be when left unchallenged. 4. Talking to yourself, curse claimed. Self-talk could be misheard as incantations. Picture yourself walking home at dusk in a medieval village, muttering under your breath. Maybe you're reciting a grocery list, barley, turnips, cheese, or softly humming a tune to keep yourself company. In today's world, no one would think twice about it. But in the Middle Ages, That simple habit could ruin your life. Talking to yourself was not seen as quirky or harmless. It was seen as evidence of spellcasting. Words carried immense weight in a time when most people were illiterate and when speech itself felt infused with sacred or supernatural power. To mutter under your breath was to invite suspicion that you were conjuring demons. Why did this habit provoke so much fear? First, silence defined medieval villages. There were no cars, no radios, no constant hum of background noise. In that quiet, every murmur could be heard clearly across narrow streets. So when someone caught you whispering to yourself near their doorway, it wasn't a private act. It was a public performance, whether you intended it or not. Your neighbor might mishear, "Please lay eggs," to your chickens as, "Release the plague." Coincidence sealed the deal. If a misfortune struck soon after, you were the obvious culprit. Let's consider how this paranoia worked in daily life. Suppose a farmer overhears you muttering about the wind rattling your shutters. That very night, the wind dies down. Instead of attributing it to weather patterns, he assumes you've controlled the elements. The next morning, the priest knocks on your door, asking why you dared to manipulate the skies. Even prayer became risky. A whispered devotion outside the church could look suspiciously like incantations. Unless it was formal Latin recited under supervision, your quiet words could condemn you. And it didn't stop at self-talk. Talking to animals, something humans have always done, was practically an invitation to be labeled a witch. Imagine a woman telling her cow, "Good girl," while milking. To neighbors, that wasn't affection. It was commanding a demonic familiar to produce milk unnaturally. Cats, of course, made it worse. If you were overheard chatting to your cat about supper, gossips swore you were instructing it to hex the miller's wife. The line between tenderness and treachery was terrifyingly thin. Real-life stories prove just how far this went. Trial records from England and Germany often include testimony about strange mutterings. A witness might say they heard the accused whisper words they didn't recognize while sewing, brewing ale, or even singing softly. The fact that no one else understood the words was enough to brand them as spells. In truth, they might have been singing nonsense rhymes or reciting recipes, but under the weight of paranoia, that nuance didn't matter. Here's where we can pause and analyze. Why were words so feared? In medieval Europe, literacy was rare, and language felt mysterious. The church tightly controlled sacred texts, and Latin was the language of power. Ordinary people couldn't read or understand Latin, so to hear someone speaking quietly, in private words, was unsettling. Language outside of the approved format felt dangerous, uncontrollable, and potentially heretical. In that sense, self-talk wasn't just odd. It was rebellion against linguistic authority. But think of how common self-talk really is. Psychologists today tell us it's natural and even healthy. Athletes use it to focus. Students mutter while solving problems. Many of us pep talk ourselves through challenges. What medieval people mistook for spells was often just the universal human need to process thoughts aloud. The suspicion says more about their worldview than about the accused. Another layer is fear of coincidence. Superstition thrives on patterns, even false ones. If someone mutters about wishing it would rain, and the next day it rains, villagers conclude cause and effect. We might laugh at that now, but ask yourself, how often do people today still link coincidences in ways that ignore logic? Think of conspiracy theories that take two unrelated events and weave them into a story of hidden intent. The medieval fear of muttering was their version of that. connecting dots that didn't exist, because it felt safer to blame someone than to accept randomness. Imagine the emotional burden of living under such scrutiny. You catch yourself whispering while sewing, then stop abruptly, heart pounding, because you notice your neighbor watching. You rehearse conversations in your head but dare not voice them aloud. Silence becomes survival. Over time, this pressure eroded trust and turned ordinary behaviors into risks. Self-expression was stifled, not by laws alone, but by the constant gaze of a suspicious community. There's a modern lesson here. When societies fear what they don't understand, they target the most visible symbols of difference. In medieval Europe, it was muttering, cats, and herbs. Today, it might be different cultural practices, unfamiliar languages, or misunderstood habits. The principle remains: fear plus ignorance breeds accusation. The tragedy is that it punishes harmless behaviors, silencing individuality in favor of conformity. Let's return to that medieval villager, walking home under the quiet sky. They mutter to themselves about tomorrow's chores, unaware that across the lane a neighbor listens. The next day, when the miller's goat falls sick, the dots connect in the community's mind. Whispers plus misfortune equals witchcraft. It's chilling how little it took to condemn someone, and how fragile the line was between normal life and mortal danger. Talking to yourself, something as human as breathing, became grounds for accusation. And that's the haunting truth of superstition. It can turn the most innocent acts into fatal evidence. 5. Social life. Suspicion breeds. Whether too social or too isolated, suspicion followed. Now imagine this. In your medieval village, whether you were the life of the party or the quiet one who kept to yourself, you were already walking a tightrope of suspicion. Social life wasn't about preference, it was about survival. Too many friends? Clearly you'd bewitched people into liking you. Too few? Just as bad. You must have cursed anyone who came near you. In a society obsessed with balance, either extreme could mark you as dangerous. Let's start with popularity. Picture a woman whose bread recipe was so good that half the village came to her door for a taste. Instead of attributing her success to skill or generosity, people whispered, "She's enchanting them." If she danced too well at a festival, it wasn't talent, it was witchcraft tempting men with wicked moves. If neighbors helped her fix her roof, clearly they were under a spell. Popularity wasn't a blessing, it was a curse disguised as charm. Now swing to the other extreme. Solitude. A man who preferred tending his garden alone, or a widow who avoided gossip, was equally at risk. In an age where community was survival, standing apart looked suspicious. If you skipped a festival, people assumed you were plotting rituals under the moon. If you left early, you were sneaking home to hex the dancers. If you stayed until the very end, you were gathering gossip to fuel your sorcery. No matter what you did, the conclusion was the same. Your social choices were never your own. They were signs of sinister intent. Family ties didn't help. If your relatives were popular, villagers said you leached off their reputation with magic. If your relatives were disliked, suspicion ran in the bloodline. The paranoia was designed to trap you, to leave no path untainted. Even trying to balance things out could backfire. If you went from shy to sociable, people whispered that dark forces had converted you. If you suddenly withdrew, you must have made a new pact. It was a flawless system, if the goal was to keep everyone paranoid. This dynamic had devastating consequences. Festivals, which should have been moments of joy, became dangerous minefields. Dancing, laughing, even the simple act of socializing turned into potential evidence. Think about that for a moment. In a world already harsh with disease and famine, Even your moments of fun could be weaponized against you. People lived in a constant state of performance, trying to appear normal, but never too normal, because the definition of acceptable shifted with every whisper. Let's ground this in a real story. In 1692 Salem, Massachusetts, though a later context, the same logic appeared. Sarah Good, accused of witchcraft, was known to be quarrelsome and unpopular. Her lack of friends worked against her, making it easier for villagers to believe she cursed others. Meanwhile, Sarah Osborne, also accused, was isolated and avoided church gatherings, fueling suspicion. Salem may have been across the ocean and centuries later, but the underlying fear was identical. Deviance from the expected social script equaled danger. Here's the deeper insight. Social suspicion wasn't really about witches. It was about control. Communities functioned by conformity, and those who stood out, whether by charisma or solitude, threatened stability. Branding them witches became a way to enforce sameness, to police behavior through fear. If you were popular, you upset the hierarchy by attracting too much loyalty. If you were quiet, you upset it by rejecting the group. Witchcraft was less about magic and more about enforcing conformity through terror. Now, let's connect this to our modern lives. Haven't we seen echoes of this dynamic today? The coworker who's too ambitious is resented. The one who's too quiet is distrusted. Schools, workplaces, and even online communities sometimes punish people simply for being different. Social suspicion is a timeless phenomenon. Witchcraft accusations were just the medieval costume at war. The lesson is clear. Societies often invent narratives to punish those who disrupt comfort zones, even if those disruptions are harmless. Imagine the inner life of a medieval villager caught in this trap. If you were naturally extroverted, you had to tone down your joy. If you were introverted, you forced yourself into gatherings just to appear normal. Authenticity wasn't safe. You learned to live behind masks, to guard your laughter, your quiet moments, your friendships. In such a world, paranoia didn't just kill individuals, it suffocated entire communities. No one could thrive when everyone feared being noticed too much or too little. So what can we take from this? The Middle Ages teach us that suspicion thrives on extremes. The very human need to connect, or to retreat, was weaponized against people. It's a chilling reminder that fear of difference can twist ordinary behaviors into threats. Today, we might not accuse someone of witchcraft, but we still sometimes judge people unfairly for being too much or not enough. And the echoes of that medieval paranoia linger every time society punishes individuality instead of embracing it. In the end, whether you danced joyfully in the square or sat quietly in your cottage, the village saw what it wanted to see. To them, every smile, every silence, every friendship was evidence waiting to be turned into accusation. And in a system that thrived on fear, there was no safe way to simply be yourself. 6. Midwives, life's judge. Helping with birth could swing you toward suspicion. Now let's step into one of the most precarious roles a woman could hold in the Middle Ages, that of the midwife. At first glance, this role was one of profound importance. Midwives were entrusted with ushering new life into the world, often the only hope a woman had during childbirth. Yet, as respected as this position might have seemed, it was also one of the most dangerous. A single complication during labor, an infant's sudden death, or even a recovery that seemed too miraculous, could turn admiration into accusation. Childbirth in medieval Europe was nothing short of perilous. Without modern medicine, mortality rates for mothers and infants were tragically high. Infection, hemorrhage, and obstructed labor were common, and survival often came down to chance. But villagers didn't see it that way. Misfortune demanded explanation, And in a deeply religious society, every event had to carry moral or spiritual weight. If a baby died, someone was at fault. If both mother and child survived against the odds, someone must have bargained with dark powers. Either way, the midwife stood in the center of suspicion. Childbirth in medieval Europe was nothing short of perilous. Without modern medicine, mortality rates for mothers and infants were tragically high. Infection, hemorrhage, and obstructed labor were common, and survival often came down to chance. But villagers didn't see it that way. Misfortune demanded explanation, and in a deeply religious society, every event had to carry moral or spiritual weight. If a baby died, someone was at fault. If both mother and child survived against the odds, someone must have bargained with dark powers. Either way, the midwife stood in the center of suspicion. Herbs made the problem worse. Midwives had generations of practical knowledge about how to ease labor, reduce bleeding, or calm fever. But these very skills were viewed with suspicion. A birthing tonic looked eerily similar to a witch's brew. A poultice for bleeding looked like a ritual concoction. Even the use of boiled water, a practice midwives sometimes employed for cleanliness, was seen as unnatural extravagance. Why boil water unless you were preparing for sorcery? And then there was the issue of knowledge. Midwives knew intimate details of families, who became pregnant, who miscarried, which children resembled their fathers a little less than they should have. This gave them power in a society where gossip traveled faster than truth. That power made people uneasy. A woman who knew too much was already halfway to being labeled a witch. It didn't take much for jealousy, rivalry, or resentment to spark accusations that her knowledge came from demons rather than experience. Now think about this from a psychological perspective. Villagers lived with constant fear of infant mortality. Every birth carried enormous emotional stakes, not only for the family but for the entire community. When grief demanded a villain, the midwife, present at the scene, performing strange rituals with herbs, whispering encouragements, became the obvious choice. It was easier to accuse her of witchcraft than to accept the randomness and fragility of life. Blame offered control, even if it was misplaced. There's also a gender dynamic at play. Midwifery was one of the few professions dominated by women, a rare sphere where women's expertise was valued. That very independence, however, made them threatening. Male physicians, often less effective but backed by the church, competed with midwives for authority. Branding midwives as witches undermined their credibility and reinforced patriarchal control. What we see here is more than superstition. It's a power struggle, cloaked in religious fear. If we compare this to modern times, we notice echoes. Even today, women in medicine, science, or leadership roles sometimes face skepticism or backlash, not rooted in their ability, but in societal discomfort with their authority. The persecution of midwives in the Middle Ages wasn't just about herbs or childbirth. It was about challenging who had the right to hold knowledge and power. Picture the midwife herself. She arrives at a cottage in the dead of night, lantern in hand, herbs tucked in her pouch. She guides the mother through hours of agony, whispers words of comfort, massages her belly, prepares a poultice. At dawn, a healthy baby cries. She leaves exhausted, but proud. By afternoon, rumors spread. Her hands were too skilled, her remedies too effective. Or worse, if the child died, the very same neighbors accuse her of consorting with demons. Her entire livelihood rests on outcomes she cannot control, in a world where failure and success both carry deadly risks. And yet, despite the danger, women continued this work. They kept delivering babies, tending to mothers, passing down herbal knowledge. They embodied resilience. And that's the paradox of the midwife. Celebrated for her gifts when things went well, condemned for them when they went wrong. The lesson we take from this is profound. Societies that fail to understand science often punish those who practice it. When fear and ignorance dominate, knowledge becomes a liability. Midwives remind us of the cost of misunderstanding and of the courage required to stand in the gap between life and death, even when that gap could swallow you whole. 7. Weather whispers. Storm sorcery. Predicting or influencing weather was seen as magical. Picture yourself in a medieval village, staring at the sky as dark clouds gather. Today we might check a weather app or shrug it off as nature's whim. But in the Middle Ages, bad weather wasn't random, it was intentional. And if hail crushed crops, frost killed seedlings, or lightning struck too close to home, someone had to be responsible. More often than not, that someone was the neighbor already considered a little odd. Accusations of controlling the weather were among the most common charges of witchcraft, and they reveal a lot about how humans cope with chaos. Weather was the lifeblood of medieval life. Crops, livestock, and survival all depended on its patterns. A late frost could mean starvation. A flood could wash away months of labor. In such fragile conditions, people needed explanations. Without science, they leaned on suspicion. If you happened to mutter about the rain and the next day it poured, congratulations, you just summoned a storm. If your garden thrived while others withered, you clearly had whispered to the clouds. Logic wasn't necessary. Coincidence was enough. Some accusations even bordered on the absurd. In parts of Europe, people believed witches could milk storm clouds like cows, drawing rain for their fields at the expense of their neighbors. Travelers might pass through and declare, "The weather was fine until I reached this village." That alone could cast suspicion on the locals. Church sermons fanned the flames, warning that witches called on Satan to send storms as punishment or to protect their own harvests. Once that idea took root, every odd-shaped cloud became a sign of sorcery. Let's consider how this played out in daily life. Imagine you're a woman who lives near the edge of the fields. A thunderstorm rolls in. Lightning strikes frighteningly close to your cottage. To your neighbors, this isn't random. It's evidence that you were summoning fire from the heavens. Or picture a year of drought. The priest declares it God's punishment, but the villagers mutter that you bound the clouds with spells. Even when you suffered alongside them, suspicion didn't care. Misery demanded a scapegoat. History records chilling examples of this paranoia. In 1562, in the French town of Weissensteig, a terrible hailstorm destroyed crops. Dozens of women were accused of witchcraft and executed for supposedly conjuring the storm. Similar panics rippled across Europe whenever weather turned deadly. The tragedy is that these executions did nothing to stop the weather, but they did succeed in feeding fear and reinforcing superstition. If we pause here, there's an important insight. Weather is inherently unpredictable, even today with satellites and forecasts. In the Middle Ages, its randomness was intolerable. Humans crave control, and when they can't have it, they invent explanations. Blaming witches was less about punishing real magic and more about creating a story that restored a sense of order. If a storm had a culprit, then it wasn't meaningless chaos. It was a moral drama, and someone could be punished for it. And isn't that something we still do today? Think of how modern disasters often spark finger-pointing. When floods devastate cities, people argue about who failed in planning or policy. When wildfires rage, conspiracy theories emerge. Humans struggle to accept randomness. Instead, we hunt for villains, sometimes real, often imagined. The medieval witch trials over weather show us just how deep that instinct runs. The suspicion of weather control also highlights a dangerous paradox. Even though everyone suffered from storms, droughts, and floods, the unlucky few accused of causing them suffered twice. First, from the weather, then from their neighbors. Imagine losing your own harvest to hail, then being dragged to court because your suffering was interpreted as proof you redirected the storm. It was a lose-lose situation, fueled by desperation. There's also a symbolic element here. Weather represented forces bigger than humanity. Divine will, natural chaos, cosmic balance. To accuse someone of controlling it was to accuse them of usurping God's authority. That was the ultimate crime in a society where religion permeated every corner of life. You weren't just blamed for a storm. You were accused of challenging heaven itself. And yet, in hindsight, we can see how wrong they were. Science tells us that weather responds to atmospheric pressure, temperature, and geography, not whispered words. But in their ignorance, medieval people saw correlation where none existed. If you happened to predict rain, or if your cottage stood where lightning struck, you became a living target for collective fear. Think of the personal toll. A farmer whose crops failed could channel grief into anger, pointing to his neighbor as the reason for his misery. A priest could restore authority by condemning someone as a weather witch. A community could find unity in scapegoating one of its own. These accusations weren't just about superstition, they were about survival, control, and the fragile bonds of community stretched thin by hardship. So what's the lesson here? It's that when people face forces they can't control, they often invent someone to blame. In the Middle Ages, it was witches controlling storms. Today, it might be politicians, corporations, or conspiracies. The human impulse hasn't changed. We still search for simple answers to complex problems. The difference is whether we let fear dictate our response or whether we seek truth through knowledge. Imagine, finally, the accused woman standing in the village square as thunder rumbles overhead. The very storm that terrified her neighbors is now used as proof against her. She has no defense because every outcome, rain, drought, lightning, confirms the accusation. That's the cruelty of superstition. It builds a trap with no escape. And in that trap, the weather itself becomes a weapon, turning nature's unpredictability into humanity's greatest condemnation. 8. Skin marks. Witch's brand. Moles or birthmarks could be twisted as devil's sign. Now let's turn our gaze from the skies to the skin. Because in the Middle Ages, even your body could betray you. A simple mole, freckle, birthmark, or scar was enough to condemn you as a witch. These witches' marks weren't just blemishes to the medieval imagination. They were interpreted as contracts signed with the devil himself. Forget ink and parchment. Satan supposedly preferred to initial his deals directly on human flesh. That little spot on your arm wasn't innocent. It was evidence that you had nursed a demonic familiar or borne the devil's brand. The belief was both widespread and terrifyingly arbitrary. Any irregularity of skin could be twisted into proof of guilt. A strawberry-shaped birthmark? Clearly a magical seal. A scar shaped vaguely like a crescent moon? Proof of midnight rituals. Even beauty marks, admired in other cultures, were seen as portals for evil spirits. Imagine standing before a panel of inquisitors as they scrutinized every inch of your skin, ready to declare ordinary imperfections as supernatural evidence. Your body became a crime scene, and you were guilty by anatomy. Witch hunters even devised crude tests to find these marks. During interrogations, the accused were stripped and poked with needles or pins. If the spot bled or caused pain, it was considered normal. But if it didn't, if nerves simply failed to react, then it was a devil's mark. The logic was twisted. Human skin varies in sensitivity, and some areas are naturally numb. But to the zealots, this was ironclad proof that the devil had touched you. It's chilling to imagine how many lives were destroyed by such pseudoscience masquerading as evidence. Let's make this more tangible with a real example. In 1645, during the English Civil War, Matthew Hopkins, the self-proclaimed witchfinder general, conducted notorious hunts across East Anglia. One of his methods was exactly this: stripping women and pricking their skin in search of insensitive spots. Those unlucky enough to have a birthmark in the wrong place were condemned. Hopkins executed dozens, not because they performed magic, but because their bodies bore the marks of ordinary human variation. Why did these marks carry such weight? Part of the reason lies in medieval symbolism. The body was seen as a canvas for the soul. Imperfections were thought to reflect inner corruption. If God created humanity in His image, then any deviation must point to dark influence. This rigid thinking turned natural diversity into moral judgment. A mark wasn't just skin deep. It was believed to reveal your allegiance in the cosmic battle between good and evil. There's also a cultural irony worth noting. In some traditions, outside of Europe, birthmarks were considered signs of blessing or divine connection. In parts of Asia, for example, unusual marks were linked to past lives or spiritual destiny. But in medieval Europe, obsessed with rooting out heresy, the same marks became fatal liabilities. It shows how context transforms meaning. What is sacred in one culture becomes cursed in another. Let's pause and reflect. The witch's mark belief reveals how societies often weaponize the body itself. When fear reigns, even the most intimate and unchangeable aspects of identity can become grounds for persecution. Today, we might think we've moved beyond this, but haven't we seen echoes? People still face discrimination based on skin color, scars, or physical differences. The medieval witch's mark is just an early chapter in the long history of policing bodies through prejudice. Think of the psychological burden. Imagine being a woman with a large birthmark across her shoulder. Every day you cover it carefully, terrified of what others might think. Or picture an elderly man with a cluster of moles, knowing that if someone decided to accuse him, those spots would become evidence. There was no defense, because explanations didn't matter. Whether you claimed you were born with it or acquired it later, both stories confirmed guilt. Born with it. Clearly destined for witchcraft. Acquired later? Proof of a pact. It was a trap with no exit. The cruelty of this system lies in its self-fulfilling logic. Once people believed the devil left physical marks, they saw them everywhere. Every freckle became sinister, every scar suspicious, and because everyone has marks of some kind, no one was truly safe. This universality made it the perfect accusation, because if suspicion fell on you, inquisitors would always find something to confirm it. So what lesson do we draw from this? It's that fear thrives when it disguises itself as certainty. By turning random bodily traits into proof, medieval society convinced itself it had found an objective way to spot witches. But in truth, it was nothing more than prejudice codified as evidence. The witch's mark wasn't real. It was a projection of fear onto the skin. Now imagine standing in that cold stone chamber, stripped before a jury of your neighbors. A finger points to a mole on your arm, gasps ripple through the crowd. To them, it's no longer just skin, it's the devil's autograph. In that moment, you realize the cruelest truth of all. Your body, the very thing that carries you through life, has been transformed into a death sentence. 9. Healing too fast. Dark deeds. Curing swiftly was seen as unnatural interference. Let's step now into the world of healing. A world where compassion could turn into condemnation with terrifying speed. In the Middle Ages, medicine was crude, inconsistent, and often more harmful than helpful. Doctors prescribed bloodletting, leeches, and prayers. Recovery was slow, painful, and uncertain. Against this backdrop, if you happened to heal someone too quickly, you weren't celebrated. You were accused of meddling with dark forces. Paradoxically, the very act of saving lives could mark you as a witch. Imagine the scenario. A woman tends to her sick neighbor with a simple remedy: willow bark tea. Within a day, the fever breaks. The patient regains strength. Instead of gratitude, villagers murmur that no natural cure could work so fast. Clearly, she has used sorcery. In truth, willow bark contains salicin, a compound we now recognize as the precursor to aspirin. But in the medieval mind, efficacy equaled evil. If you healed someone without bloodletting or holy chants, then your methods had to be infernal. The logic went like this. Illness came from God, either as punishment for sin or as a divine test. Healing, therefore, should take time, prayer, and suffering. If you sped up the process, you were interfering with God's will. You weren't helping, you were challenging the divine order. That belief created an impossible bind. Work slowly, and patients suffered, sometimes fatally. Work efficiently, and you invited accusations of witchcraft. No good deed went unpunished. Herbalists bore the brunt of this paradox. They relied on plants whose active ingredients worked quickly and effectively. A salve of comfrey could speed the healing of wounds. A tincture of peppermint soothed indigestion within hours. To us, this looks like early pharmacology. To them, it looked like forbidden magic. Villagers marveled at how swiftly symptoms disappeared and concluded the healer must have signed a pact with unseen forces. What was really biology became misinterpreted as sorcery. Coincidence played a dangerous role, too. Imagine the baker's wife bedridden for a week. A neighbor brings her soup, and the next morning she's well. Instead of thanking the cook, the villagers wonder whether the broth contained a resurrection spell. The healer's kindness becomes evidence of witchcraft. Even the choice of who was healed could spark suspicion. Help an unpopular villager recover, and suddenly you were accused of empowering troublemakers through demonic assistance. Healing the wrong person was as dangerous as harming the right one. We have historical examples that show how lethal this suspicion could be. In 1324, Lady Alice Kyteler of Ireland was accused of sorcery, partly because she was seen using potions and ointments to treat illness. Some of her patients thrived, and instead of viewing her as a skilled healer, her enemies declared that she consorted with demons. Though she eventually fled, her maid Petronilla de Meath wasn't so lucky. She was burned at the stake. Their story underscores how fragile the line was between healer and witch. Knowledge secrecy made things worse. Many healers guarded their recipes, not because they were magical, but because it was their livelihood. Sharing every formula openly would have meant losing their profession. But secrecy was reinterpreted as occultism. A locked recipe book was never just a trade secret. It was a grimoire. Even a poorly drawn herb manual could be rebranded in court as a spellbook. What we'd call intellectual property today was once proof of sorcery. Let's step back and analyze the mindset. Why was fast healing so frightening? Because it disrupted the established order. If suffering was seen as part of God's plan, then skipping suffering undermined the entire theological framework. In a way, healers became victims of their own competence. They challenged the monopoly of the church and traditional physicians, threatening both authority and income. Fear of witches wasn't just fear of evil, it was fear of losing control. Think about the emotional toll this placed on healers. To have the knowledge to help, but to risk death for using it is a tragic paradox. Imagine being forced to choose between letting your neighbor suffer or risking your life by curing them. Compassion became a gamble. And yet, many continued to help, quietly, in secret, keeping traditions alive through whispered teachings and hidden gardens. Their bravery ensured that herbal knowledge survived long enough to be rediscovered by modern medicine.
The lesson here is timeless. Societies often resist what they don't understand, especially when it undermines authority. Medieval healers faced persecution because their knowledge threatened entrenched systems. Today, we see similar patterns. Innovations in science or technology often meet resistance, accused of being unnatural or dangerous. The witch trials of healers remind us that progress is frequently punished before it is praised.
Now imagine standing in a village square as someone testifies against you. She cured me overnight. Which should be the highest compliment becomes your death sentence. The irony is unbearable. Your skill, your kindness, your very gift to the community is transformed into evidence of evil. And that is the dark reality of superstition. It warps gratitude into fear and healing into heresy. 10. Widowed early. Strange independence. A young widow was often publicly suspected.
Now let's turn to another precarious situation in the medieval world: being widowed too soon. In our time, a young widow might be met with sympathy, compassion, and support. In the Middle Ages, however, she often faced something far darker: suspicion. The death of a husband, especially if it came suddenly or conveniently, was viewed not as tragedy, but as potential proof of witchcraft. A woman who gained independence, property, or freedom through widowhood was accused of having hastened her husband's end with poisons, hexes, or whispered pacts with dark forces. Marriage in medieval Europe was as much a contract as it was companionship. Husbands provided protection, property rights, and social legitimacy. When a husband died, the delicate balance of family and community economics shifted. A widow might inherit land, escape debts, or suddenly gain decision-making power she previously lacked. That shift made people nervous. Independence in women was already threatening to patriarchal norms. Add misfortune into the mix and whispers began. She must have arranged this. Consider the no-win situation widows faced. If a husband had been ill for months before dying, villagers accused the wife of letting the sickness linger so she could inherit. If he died suddenly, the suspicion was even worse. Clearly she had poisoned him or used dark charms. Even his manner of death played into the paranoia. A peaceful passing meant she had lulled him into the afterlife with sorcery. A painful death meant she had dragged him screaming toward hell. The conclusion was always the same. The wife was guilty. Behavior after the funeral only added fuel. If the widow grieved too little, she was cold and clearly relieved. If she grieved too much, she was overcompensating to hide guilt. If she remarried quickly, people whispered that she had planned everything to snare her next husband. If she didn't remarry at all, suspicion deepened. She must be sustained by the devil's pension. Every choice became incriminating. History gives us sobering examples. In 1428, during the Valais witch trials in Switzerland, records show that many widows were accused precisely because they lived alone after their husbands' deaths. Their independence made them visible targets. Without male protectors, they were vulnerable to both gossip and prosecution. It wasn't their actions that condemned them, it was their status. To live outside the expected mold of wife and dependent was to invite danger. The gender bias here is striking. Widowers, men who lost wives, rarely faced such suspicion. If a man remarried quickly, people nodded, saying, well, he needs someone to cook for him. But if a woman remarried within weeks, she was branded a black widow, sometimes literally. Patriarchal double standards meant that men's survival needs were practical, while women's survival strategies were sinister. Let's pause and think about the deeper psychology. Why were widows feared? Because they represented disruption. There's also an economic angle. Land and property were at stake. A young widow with inheritance could suddenly hold resources others wanted. Accusations of witchcraft conveniently stripped her of rights and transferred her property to others. In that sense, witch trials weren't just about superstition. They were about greed. Superstition was the excuse, but control and profit were often the real motives. Now picture the daily reality. A young woman, barely into her 30s, loses her husband. She mourns him, yet she must also fear her neighbors. Every glance, every whisper, reminds her that she's under scrutiny. If her fields do well, it's proof she prospered through dark means. If they fail, people say she's being punished for her sins. Her grief is not private, it's public spectacle, twisted into evidence against her. The tragedy here is twofold. On one hand, widows genuinely struggled to survive in a world that offered few protections. On the other, those who managed to endure were punished for their success. They became symbols of danger, not resilience. What should have been stories of strength turned into cautionary tales of suspicion. And yet, there's a resilience worth honoring. Many widows did find ways to survive, despite the fear. They leaned on extended family, traded goods, grew their own food, and in some cases, even took on community roles that men once dominated. They proved, quietly and against all odds, that independence was possible. That quiet defiance is part of the legacy buried beneath centuries of accusation. So what lesson does this give us? It reminds us how easily societies demonize those who don't fit their expectations. The widow's independence, instead of being respected, was reframed as unnatural. The suspicion surrounding her wasn't about magic, it was about discomfort with women making choices. And that discomfort led to persecution. Now, imagine yourself in her shoes, walking home from your husband's funeral, grief heavy on your shoulders. You notice villagers' eyes linger too long. You hear a whispered, "Convenient, isn't it?" In that moment, you realize you are not only mourning your husband, you are fighting for your own survival. Widowhood instead of freedom has become a sentence. 11. Curious objects. Unholy evidence. Owning odd items invited accusations of sorcery. Now, let's turn to one of the most human and universal desires, the wish to predict the future. In the Middle Ages, even something as small as reading signs in the sky, interpreting dreams, or tossing bones on the ground could mark you as a witch. Fortune-telling, whether casual or serious, was seen as tampering with divine will. To seek knowledge of tomorrow was to trespass into God's territory, and to provide that knowledge to others was to risk being branded an agent of the devil. Imagine the village setting. A young girl wonders aloud if she'll marry soon. An older neighbor, half joking, says, "If the crows fly west tomorrow, you'll have a husband by harvest." It's a harmless bit of folk wisdom, a way to comfort or amuse. But if the crows do fly west and the girl becomes betrothed, suddenly the prediction looks sinister. Coincidence becomes proof. Villagers whisper that the neighbor must have arranged it with dark powers. A casual remark spirals into an accusation of sorcery. One of the most common folk practices was using simple objects to divine the future. Casting lots, throwing bones, or watching candle flames. These rituals weren't sinister to those practicing them. They were forms of reassurance in uncertain times. But they terrified authorities because they bypassed the church. Knowledge from dice, tea leaves, or stars undermined priestly authority, and that made it dangerous. Thus, Even innocent curiosity was recast as demonic meddling. Historical records show how deadly this could be. In 1485, during the Milanese witch trials, women accused of telling fortunes with beans and pebbles were executed. Their predictions, harmless games to pass time, were twisted into evidence of consorting with devils. The same happened in Germany and Scotland, where women who claimed to know whether a child would live or die were tortured into confessions. What began as folk tradition ended in blood. Let's pause here and think about why fortune-telling was so feared. Life in the Middle Ages was unstable. War, famine, disease, and sudden death loomed constantly. People desperately wanted certainty, but the church insisted that only God could grant that. Anyone else providing answers threatened both the theology and the social order. Fortune tellers weren't just witches. They were rebels against an information monopoly. The accusation of witchcraft was as much about protecting authority as it was about punishing superstition. There's a universal irony here. Humans across cultures have always sought glimpses of the future. Ancient Romans read entrails. Chinese sages consulted the I Ching. Norse seers read the runes. Fortune-telling wasn't unique to medieval Europe. It was part of humanity's shared attempt to wrestle control from uncertainty. But in Europe's witch trials, that impulse was criminalized, especially when practiced by the poor, the female, or the powerless. Think of the personal toll. A mother tossing pebbles to reassure herself that her child's fever would break wasn't trying to summon demons, she was trying to soothe her fear. Yet if her child lived, she was branded as a sorceress who bargained with dark powers. If her child died, she was accused of failing because her magic was weak. Either way, the act of hoping for certainty became grounds for condemnation. And haven't we seen echoes of this even today? People still consult horoscopes, tarot cards, or fortune cookies. Most treat it lightly, a bit of entertainment, yet others cling to it in times of uncertainty. The instinct to seek meaning in randomness hasn't changed. The difference is that now, we don't usually burn people for it. But the suspicion of fortune-telling in the Middle Ages reveals just how threatening it was when knowledge came from anywhere other than sanctioned authorities. Picture, finally, the accused fortune-teller standing before her judges. They demand to know how she predicted that the harvest would fail. She answers honestly, "I saw worms in the wheat." But the court twists her words. The worms weren't signs of blight. They were imps, clearly sent to her by Satan. Her attempt to warn her neighbors becomes the very evidence that condemns her. That's the trap of superstition. Even when truth is plain, fear reshapes it into guilt. The lesson is clear. In a society terrified of the unknown, anyone who claimed or seemed to hold knowledge of tomorrow became a threat. And that threat was not tolerated. To predict the future was not to be wise, it was to invite the pyre. 12. Laughing or smiling equals shocking proof. Unusual behavior during solemn events raised alarm. Now, let's step into the mysterious hours of the night. Today, we might admire the night owl, the person who works late, studies by lamp, or simply enjoys the quiet after sunset. But in the Middle Ages, being awake at odd hours wasn't just unusual, it was dangerous. If you were seen moving about at midnight, carrying a candle, or even sitting up by the fire, people might conclude you weren't simply restless. You were communing with spirits, brewing potions, or attending the infamous witches' Sabbath. Medieval life followed the rhythms of the sun. Most villagers rose at dawn and retired soon after dark, their days dictated by the fields and the scarcity of artificial light. To deviate from this natural rhythm was to arouse suspicion. Why would anyone stay awake while others slept, unless for sinister reasons? A woman spinning thread in the quiet hours might be praised for her diligence by day, but if caught doing the same work at night, she was accused of spinning curses into her yarn.
Let's imagine a scene. A widow, unable to sleep, sits by the hearth mending clothes. The glow of her fire flickers through the cracks of her shutters. A passing neighbor sees it and mutters, "Why is she awake when honest folk sleep?" The next morning, rumors spread. Was she calling the dead? Did she summon the storm that rattled the shutters at midnight? What began as insomnia becomes evidence of sorcery. Traveling at night was even worse. Roads were considered haunted by spirits, bandits, and worse. If someone spotted you walking under the moonlight, perhaps heading to help a sick neighbor, you risked being accused of attending a witches' gathering. Church sermons warned that witches flew to Sabbaths under cover of darkness to feast with the devil, and anyone with nocturnal habits became a likely candidate. Even something as innocent as gazing at the stars could be misinterpreted as studying the heavens for spells. Historical cases back this up. In the German witch trials of the 16th century, many accused women were said to have wandered at night. Witnesses testified that they saw them walking fields or woods after dark, which was enough to brand them as witches. Nighttime, in the medieval imagination, belonged to the devil. Anyone who trespassed into that realm risked being claimed as his servant. But why this fear of the night? Part of it was practical. Nighttime was when predators roamed, thieves struck, and dangers multiplied. Fear of darkness was natural, but fear became superstition when people sought explanations beyond the ordinary. If a cow died overnight and someone had been seen awake, the two events were linked. Darkness bred imagination, and imagination bred accusation. Here's where we can pause to reflect. Being awake at night was really about breaking expectations. In a rigid society, conformity was survival. Deviating from the pattern, even in something as natural as sleep, was enough to brand you suspicious. Night owls represented unpredictability, and unpredictability threatened the fragile order. It's the same logic that made left-handedness dangerous. Difference itself was criminalized. There's also a symbolic layer. Daytime represented God's light, safety, and truth. Nighttime represented chaos, temptation, and sin. To be active at night was to cross into liminal space, a place where rules blurred. For the medieval imagination, liminality was dangerous. You were neither fully in the world of the living nor fully in the world of the dead, neither in light nor in dark. And anyone inhabiting such thresholds risked being labeled unholy. Think of the toll this suspicion took. Imagine being a mother with a colicky infant. You pace the floorboards at midnight, whispering lullabies, praying for the baby to sleep. Yet the neighbors hear your voice and assume you're chanting incantations. Or picture a man who works late repairing tools for the next day. His industriousness is not praised. It is twisted into evidence of secret rituals. The very effort to care for one's family becomes ammunition for accusation. And yet, there's irony here. Some of the greatest medieval thinkers, monks, astronomers, scholars, worked at night. Candlelit hours were when manuscripts were copied, stars were charted, and prayers were chanted. But those men operated under sanctioned authority, cloaked by the church. When ordinary villagers did the same without that protection, their nighttime activity was recast as diabolical. Again, we see that witchcraft accusations were less about the act itself and more about who performed it. 13. Living alone equals layer of evil. Solitude was interpreted as plotting with spirits. Now, let's step into the realm of animals, specifically cats. Today, cats are cherished companions, internet celebrities, and symbols of independence. But in the Middle Ages,
They were deeply entangled in the fear of witchcraft. To own a cat, especially a black one, was to risk being accused of harboring a familiar, a supernatural creature sent by the devil to assist in dark deeds. A purring pet by the fire wasn't seen as comfort, it was seen as evidence. The roots of this fear ran deep. Cats, with their nocturnal habits and reflective eyes, seemed mysterious and otherworldly. Unlike dogs, which served obvious roles as hunters or guards, cats were more enigmatic. They slinked through shadows, appeared and disappeared silently, and stared too long as if knowing secrets. In a world where the unknown bred suspicion, these traits transformed cats into symbols of the uncanny. The church also fueled this association. Medieval texts sometimes linked cats with heresy and paganism. In 1233, Pope Gregory IX issued a decree that black cats were instruments of Satan, reinforcing the link between felines and diabolical forces. From then on, cats became targets of persecution. In some towns, cats were burned alongside accused witches, as if destroying both the woman and her assistant in one ritual act of purification. Imagine being a poor widow living alone with a single cat for company. The animal keeps away mice, a practical necessity in a time when food stores were vulnerable. But the very act of keeping such a creature becomes incriminating. If your bread spoils, neighbors whisper the cat bewitched it. If a cow dries up, they say the cat sucked its milk under your command. If you're seen talking affectionately to the cat, it isn't love, it's sorcery. Your simple companionship becomes grounds for death. Historical examples are plentiful. In the 16th and 17th centuries, trial records often mention imps, or familiars, taking the form of cats. In Essex, England, a woman named Elizabeth Francis confessed under torture that her cat, named Sathon, helped her perform malice for decades. Of course, this confession came from unbearable pain, but it became evidence in court. The story spread, reinforcing the myth that cats weren't animals at all, but demonic partners. The irony is painful. While cats were feared in Europe, in other parts of the world, they were revered. In ancient Egypt, cats were sacred, associated with the goddess Bastet. Killing one was a grave crime. But in medieval Europe, the pendulum swung to the opposite extreme. Reverence became revulsion, and animals once considered divine became deadly. It's a striking reminder that meaning is culturally constructed. What is holy in one time and place can be cursed in another. Superstition about cats also had devastating consequences. During the Black Death of the 14th century, cats were slaughtered en masse because they were linked with witches. Ironically, this worsened the plague. With fewer cats, rat populations exploded, and rats carried the fleas that spread the disease. Fear of witchcraft didn't just destroy women and cats, it amplified human suffering on a continental scale. This is one of history's most tragic examples of how superstition can literally kill. Let's step back and reflect. Why were cats so threatening to medieval minds? Because they embodied independence. Unlike dogs, they couldn't be easily controlled. They came and went as they pleased, obeying no one. In a rigid society that demanded order and conformity, cats represented something untamed, something aligned with the mysterious. Witches, often women living outside of strict social norms, were linked to these animals precisely because both refused to be fully domesticated. Think of the human toll. For a lonely woman, a cat was more than a mouser. It was a companion, a source of comfort. Yet that bond became twisted into something sinister. Owning a cat could mean the difference between life and death if suspicion fell your way. Imagine stroking your pet by the fire, hearing its gentle purr, and knowing that sound might be the last comfort you feel before being dragged to trial. The lesson here is sobering. Fear often attaches itself to the unknown and the independent. In cats, medieval society saw reflections of its anxieties. Creatures who defied control, who thrived in the night, who walked their own paths. Instead of admiring those traits, people demonized them. And in demonizing the cat, they demonized the women who loved them. Picture this final image. A woman in her cottage. Her cat curled in her lap. To her, it's warmth in a cold world. To her neighbors, it's proof of a pact with the devil. She doesn't know that tomorrow, the two of them might face the flames together. And that chilling thought reminds us how superstition turned the most ordinary acts of love into crimes. 14. Predictions equals hexes in disguise. Foresight or forecasts were conflated with magic. Now let's explore another behavior that could doom you in the Middle Ages.
Laughter or smiling at the wrong moment.
In a society steeped in fear, ritual, and solemnity, joy itself could become suspicious. If you smiled at a funeral, laughed during a sermon, or showed cheerfulness while others grieved, people didn't see it as resilience or nervous habit. They saw it as proof you were allied with dark forces, delighting in human misery. Even the most innocent grin could be twisted into damning evidence. Imagine attending a funeral. The air is heavy with incense and grief. Everyone bows their heads in mourning, but perhaps you remember a fond memory of the deceased, and a small smile escapes. Instead of being seen as warmth, that smile is noticed by watchful eyes. She's happy he's gone. She must have had a hand in it. The next whisper spreads. Her laughter is the devil's echo. A moment of humanity becomes fuel for accusation. The suspicion extended far beyond funerals. Laughter during storms, during illness, or even during sermons was enough to raise eyebrows. Medieval clergy taught that witches took pleasure in calamity, feeding off the suffering of others. If you laughed when the mill caught fire, it wasn't nervousness, it was your spell at work. If you smiled during a neighbor's misfortune, it wasn't coincidence, it was celebration of your curse fulfilled. Your emotions were no longer your own. They were interpreted as confessions. Historical anecdotes capture this paranoia vividly. In German witch trial records, one accused woman was said to have laughed when a cow fell dead in the field. To modern eyes, the laughter could have been disbelief, hysteria, or even an attempt to mask fear. But to villagers, it was undeniable proof. In another case, a young girl giggled during church while looking at a friend. That innocent slip became part of testimony against her, framed as mockery of God. Why was laughter so threatening? Because it broke the expected script of collective emotion. Medieval life revolved around ritual, ritual in worship, ritual in mourning, ritual in work. To deviate from that rhythm was to challenge order. A smile in a moment of grief wasn't just inappropriate, it was rebellion against the sacred. In a worldview where every event carried divine meaning, your laughter meant you stood with the devil, not with God. And yet, laughter is one of the most human reactions to stress. Psychologists today recognize inappropriate laughter as a coping mechanism. In the face of tragedy, people often laugh to release tension or to mask pain. What medieval villagers saw as evidence of evil was, in reality, evidence of humanity. The tragedy lies in how little room there was for such nuance. The suspicion of joy also reveals something darker about fear-based societies. Happiness itself becomes threatening. To be cheerful when others suffer suggests you aren't bound by the same anxieties, and that independence, emotional or otherwise, was dangerous. Witches weren't just feared for their supposed spells. They were feared for refusing to conform. Smiling when others wept symbolized freedom from the communal script, and that freedom was intolerable. Consider the toll on individuals. Imagine suppressing laughter at all costs, forcing your face into solemnity even when joy bubbles up. Imagine the fear of smiling at children playing lest someone see it during a bad harvest and claim you were mocking their misfortune. Daily life became theater, where every expression had to align with collective expectations. To step out of line, even by accident, could bring fatal consequences.
And here's the irony. Christianity itself often spoke of joy as divine, of laughter as a gift. Yet in the frenzy of witch hunting, joy was recast as sin, evidence of corruption rather than grace. The very thing that makes life bearable, smiles, laughter, lightness, was turned into a crime. Does this pattern sound familiar? Even today, society sometimes punishes those whose emotions don't fit the moment. A grieving person who doesn't cry is called cold. A worker who laughs too much is branded unprofessional. Women who smile at the wrong time are accused of being unserious, while those who don't smile enough are accused of being unfriendly. The medieval suspicion of laughter echoes in our lingering discomfort with emotional difference.
Picture one final scene. A woman stands in the village square as her neighbor testifies, "She laughed when the storm destroyed my barn." She wants to explain it was nervous laughter, or that she remembered something absurd in her panic. But no one listens. The laughter has already been judged as proof. In a society that feared joy, her smile wasn't a sign of life. It was a death sentence. 15. Longevity equals dark pact. Living past middle age made you a walking suspicion. Now we arrive at one of the cruelest ironies of all, longevity itself. In the Middle Ages, when average life expectancy hovered between 30 and 40 years, anyone who lived past 50 or 60 seemed extraordinary. But instead of being celebrated as blessed with resilience or wisdom, the elderly, especially women, were often accused of surviving through unnatural means. To live too long was to suggest you had made a pact with dark forces, trading innocence for extra years. Old age, instead of being honored, became a mark of suspicion.
The body itself betrayed the elderly. Wrinkles, warts, tooth loss, and failing eyesight became evidence of corruption. A bent spine looked like a witch's hunchback. A trembling hand looked like the shaking of one cursed. Even muttering to oneself, common in old age, was interpreted as incantation. Instead of compassion for frailty, people projected dread, turning the natural process of aging into signs of diabolical allegiance. Historical records reveal this pattern clearly. Many witch trial victims were older women, often widows living alone. In Salem, Massachusetts, Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne were both elderly outcasts when accused in 1692. In Europe, countless trial transcripts mention women in their 60s or 70s brought to court under charges that their survival itself was unnatural. The connection between old age and witchcraft was so entrenched that simply being frail and without family was enough to draw suspicion.
Why was longevity so threatening? Part of the answer lies in the psychology of survival. In a world where children died young and adults succumbed to plagues, those who lived long lives became symbols of imbalance. Survival seemed unfair, and fairness was sought in supernatural explanations. If a woman lived while younger, stronger villagers perished. Envy demanded a reason. Witchcraft filled the void. Instead of accepting randomness, people sought villains. There's also the issue of power. Older women often held knowledge, herbal remedies, midwifery skills, or folk wisdom passed down generations. With age came authority outside of the church or patriarchal structures, and that independence posed a threat. Branding them witches stripped them of influence. Once again, witchcraft accusations weren't just about fear of evil. They were about controlling who had the right to survive, to know, and to teach. The tragedy is that these women were often the most vulnerable. With husbands dead and children grown or gone, they lived on society's margins. Loneliness, poverty, and frailty should have inspired protection. Instead, they invited persecution. Imagine an old woman begging for bread. If the giver later fell ill, people claimed she cursed them when dissatisfied.
If she thrived despite hardship, they said she must have fed off demonic sustenance. Every path led to suspicion, and yet, longevity should have been celebrated. In cultures around the world, the elderly are revered as carriers of memory and wisdom. Indigenous traditions honor elders as links to ancestry. Asian philosophies often see old age as the crown of life. But in medieval Europe, fear warped this natural reverence. Instead of crowns, elders were given chains. Instead of honor, they were given trials.
The lesson here is profound. Societies that fear difference often turn survival itself into crime. Where death was common, life became suspicious. It reminds us that persecution isn't always about what people do. Sometimes it's about what they are. Old, independent, different. Any trait outside the fragile norm could be twisted into guilt. Picture the final scene. An old woman sits in the square, accused by younger neighbors who resent her survival. They point to her years as proof of a bargain with Satan. She tries to explain that she lived simply, gathering herbs, eating sparingly, enduring hardship. But her words fall on ears deafened by envy and fear. Her long life, which should have been her legacy, becomes her indictment. And in that moment, we see the darkest irony of all. In the Middle Ages, even living too long could cost you your life.